The chandeliers trembled with unspoken tension the night Baek Do-hyun snapped his fingers at her like she was furniture. He called her in clipped, contemptuous Korean certain she couldn't understand a syllable. She understood every word. And across the room a man in a black suit set down his glass, his eyes going cold as steel because no one spoke to her like that, and walked away untouched. Welcome to Unfold Korean Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. The Ondol Grand sat at the top of Cheongdam-dong like a crown balanced on the city's tallest hill, all glass and gold light spilling onto the street below. Inside, the air smelled of white truffle and old money, of perfume that cost more than a month's rent and wine older than the servers who poured it. Crystal stemware caught the chandelier light and scattered it across white tablecloths like scattered stars. This was a place where Seoul's wealthiest came not merely to eat but to be witnessed eating, where a reservation was itself a form of currency. Zuri Adeyemi moved through that glittering room the way she moved through everything in her life, quietly, precisely, without wasted motion. She had worked at the Ondol Grand for 8 months, ever since the culinary program that was supposed to change her life instead left her 26 years old, fluent in French classical technique and comparative gastronomy, and $3,000 in debt with no kitchen willing to give her a chance. So she waited tables in a restaurant she couldn't afford to eat in, folding napkins into perfect triangles, memorizing wine vintages she would never taste, and sending money home to Lagos every month without fail. She had grown up watching her mother stretch a single chicken across a week of dinners, watching her father study accounting textbooks by lamplight after working construction all day. Sacrifice was not a concept to Zuri. It was a language she had been raised speaking. And so when people asked her why a woman with 2 degrees was carrying trays in a Gangnam dining room, she simply said what her mother always told her: dignity has no ceiling, only doors you haven't opened yet. Tonight, the private dining room on the 3rd floor had been reserved for a name that made even the general manager's hands shake slightly as he reviewed the booking. Baek Do-hyun, heir to Baek Construction, a real estate empire that owned enough of southern Seoul to reshape its skyline twice over. He was 38, silver-tongued, photographed constantly beside senators and starlets, and infamous among service staff across the city for a temper that had gotten 2 restaurants' head chefs fired simply for being unlucky enough to serve him on a bad night. Across the room, seated alone at a corner table with a view of the entire floor, sat a man the staff knew only as Mr. Kwon. He came twice a month, always alone, always the same table, always ordering the same dish: mackerel, plainly grilled, no sauce. He tipped generously, spoke rarely, and radiated a stillness that made even the most confident servers lower their voices near him. Nobody asked what he did for a living. In certain parts of Seoul, that question answered itself the moment you learned to recognize the particular quality of silence that surrounded powerful, dangerous men. Kwon Hyun-woo had built his reputation the way his father had, through steel discipline, absolute control, and the terrifying calm of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He ran an organization whose name appeared in no business registry, whose influence reached into shipping ports and construction permits and half the private security contracts in the city. He was 36 years old, and in his world the only thing more dangerous than making an enemy of him was making him care about something. Tonight, without knowing it yet, someone in that private dining room was about to do both. Zuri had been assigned the 3rd floor for the evening because Mr. Han, the usual senior server, had called in sick, and because the floor manager, a nervous man named Choi, trusted her composure more than anyone else's. "Just smile, pour, and disappear," Choi told her outside the private room, sweat already beating at his temples. "Mr. Baek does not like to be noticed noticing the staff." She nodded and pushed through the door with a bottle of 2011 Chateau Margaux balanced against her forearm, her expression the practiced blank calm she had perfected over months of enduring exactly this kind of client. Baek Do-hyun sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 junior executives who laughed a half-second too early at everything he said, the particular laughter of men afraid of losing their jobs. He didn't look up when she entered. He rarely looked at the people who served him at all. "Wine," he said in English, waving a hand without glancing at her, the way one might wave away a fly. "Of course, sir," Zuri answered, stepping forward and presenting the label exactly as she'd been trained, the crest angled toward him. "The 2011 Margaux, decanted 20 minutes ago to open the tannins." He glanced at the label with mild irritation, as if her explanation was an imposition rather than a service. "I didn't ask for a lecture." "Of course," she said again, and poured without another word, her hands perfectly steady despite the flush of humiliation rising in her chest. It should have ended there, it didn't. Baek turned to his companions and said something low in Korean, Something meant to be a private joke shared only among men who assumed the woman pouring their wine understood nothing beyond, "Yes, sir, and right away, sir." He gestured towards Zuri without looking at her, his mouth curling into something between amusement and contempt. "Look at this thing," he said in Korean, the word landing sharp and ugly jujiot at an object, not a person. "They import them now for the exotic look. Not for the brains, obviously." Two junior executives laughed the nervous laughter of men who knew the joke was cruel, but were more afraid of Beek's silence than his cruelty. Zuri's hand did not shake. She had spent 3 semesters in Paris being underestimated by chefs who assumed a Nigerian woman couldn't tell a bechamel from a velouté, and she had learned the hard way that the loudest response to contempt was often no response at all, that her composure was armor no insult could pierce, if she simply refused to let it. But across the room, at a corner table with a view of everything, Kwon Hyun-woo's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He had learned Korean from his grandmother, English from tutors, but he had also spent 4 years as a teenager in Lagos, where his father had once run shipping contracts before building the empire he inherited. 4 years that left him fluent in more than language, 4 years that made him understand with total and immediate clarity exactly what word Baek Do-hyun had just used. And exactly what it meant to say it about a woman across a dining room as if she were incapable of understanding her own insult. His jaw tightened, he set his glass down without a sound. The junior executives kept laughing. Baek kept talking, oblivious, riding the high of an audience that would never dare correct him. And Zuri finished pouring the wine, straightened, and said in flawless, unhurried Korean, "Will there be anything else, sir? Or should I bring the sommelier's recommendation for the second course? I understand you prefer something bold enough to survive being disrespected." The table went silent. Baek Do-hyun's smile froze on his face like ice cracking under sudden weight. His two executives stopped laughing mid-breath, eyes darting between their boss and the woman who had just spoken his own language back to him with a precision that made his slur sound, suddenly, small and stupid rather than clever. For a long moment, nobody in the private dining room moved. "You speak Korean," Baek said finally, his voice flat, testing the ground beneath him. "I speak 4 languages, sir," Zuri replied evenly. "Korean, English, French, and Yoruba. I studied culinary arts in Paris and worked 2 years in a Michelin kitchen before I came here. I understood every word you said." She paused, her chin lifting slightly, though her tone never rose above polite. "I simply chose not to react because my dignity was never something you had the power to take." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Across the floor, Kwon Hyun-woo rose from his table, unhurried, and crossed the dining room with the calm, deliberate stride of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to walk quickly to be taken seriously. He appeared in the doorway of the private room just as Baek opened his mouth to recover some scrap of authority. And the moment the junior executive saw who was standing there, both men went white. "Mr. Kwon," one of them stammered, half rising from his chair. Baek turned, confused by the reaction, and found himself looking into the eyes of a man whose name, in certain circles that intersected uncomfortably with his own construction permits and zoning approvals, carried considerably more weight than his own. "Do you know this woman?" Baek asked, some instinct telling him the ground beneath his confidence had just shifted, though he didn't yet understand how far it would fall. Kwon Hyun-woo let the question sit unanswered for 3 full seconds, his gaze moving from Baek to Zuri and back again before he said quietly in Korean, "I know that you just insulted someone in a language you assumed she couldn't understand in a restaurant where you assumed there would be no consequences." He paused. "You assumed wrong on both counts." Baek's throat worked. "This is a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Kwon said. "I heard every word." The rest of that night unraveled in Baek Do-hyun's memory as a series of small mounting humiliations, each one smaller than the insult he delivered but somehow heavier, because each one was witnessed. The floor manager arrived within the minute, summoned by a single text from Kwon, and by the time the general manager himself appeared ashen-faced, Baek Do-hyun's dinner party had become the quietest table in the history of the Ondol Grand's private floor. Kwon did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply informed the general manager in front of Baek and his executives that the restaurant's continued relationship with Baek Construction, a relationship that supplied roughly 40% of the Ondol Grand's parent hospitality group's commercial leasing arrangements, would need to be reevaluated, given the treatment of staff he had personally witnessed. Baek opened his mouth to protest and found no words waiting for him. Later that night, after the private dining room had emptied and the restaurant had returned to its normal, glittering rhythm, Zuri found herself alone in the service corridor, catching her breath against the cool tile wall, her heart finally allowing itself to race now that no one was watching. She had held her composure through the entire encounter, had refused to let a single tremor show in her hands, but now, in private, the weight of being called an object in a room full of powerful men who assumed her silence meant her ignorance pressed down on her chest like something physical. "You did not need to defend yourself," a voice said from the corridor's entrance, low and even. She looked up to find Kwon Hyun-woo standing there, his suit jacket still perfectly pressed despite the hour, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I wasn't defending myself," Zuri said, straightening. "I was simply telling the truth. There's a difference." "Most people don't have the composure to tell the truth to a man like that," he said. "Especially not calmly enough to make it land harder than if you'd screamed." "Screaming would have gotten me fired," she said simply. "The truth at least has a chance of being believed." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile but the loosening of a jaw that rarely loosened. "Where did you learn to speak Korean like that? Most foreign staff here know perhaps 20 words, enough to apologize, not enough to correct a billionaire's grammar. My mother always said if you're going to work in someone's country, you owe it to yourself to understand every word they might use against you," Zuri said. "I took a year of intensive language study before I moved here. I wanted to be prepared for exactly this kind of moment. I just never expected it to happen quite this publicly." Kwon studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made most people uncomfortable but that Zuri met without flinching, because she had spent her entire life being looked at as if she were an anomaly and had long ago decided that discomfort belonged to the person doing the looking, not to her. "My name is Kwon Hyun-woo," he said finally. "I know," Zuri replied. "Everyone on this floor knows your name, Mr. Kwon. What they don't know is why a man who orders the same plain grilled mackerel twice a month, alone at the same table, chose tonight of all nights to stand up in a room full of people who could ruin his reputation for it." For the first time that evening, Kwon Hyun-woo actually smiled, small, brief but genuine. "Because," he said, "some things are worth the risk of being seen caring about." He left without another word, and Zuri stood alone in the corridor for a long moment afterward, trying to convince herself that the warmth spreading through her chest was simply the aftershock of adrenaline, and not something far more dangerous, the quiet, unwelcome recognition of a man who had looked at her not as an object to be catalogued or dismissed, but as someone whose dignity was worth defending in a room full of people who would never have bothered. The next morning, Seoul woke to a headline that spread through the city's business circles like wildfire. Baek Construction's stock dipped 2% within the first hour of trading, following unconfirmed reports that a major hospitality partner had quietly severed a decade-long leasing arrangement overnight. No names were mentioned in the financial press, but everyone in the industry understood exactly which restaurant group and exactly which contract had evaporated between the appetizer and the check. Zuri heard about it from Miguel No, this restaurant's version of him, a soft-spoken senior server named T-sung who burst into the staff room before her shift with his phone held aloft like evidence at a trial. "You didn't just embarrass him," T-sung said, breathless. "You cost him money, real money. Do you understand what you did last night?" "I didn't do anything," Zuri said, tying her apron with steady hands despite the anxious flutter in her stomach. "I poured wine and told the truth. Whatever happened after that wasn't mine to control." But word moved faster than she could outrun it. By that afternoon, the general manager had called her into his office, not to reprimand her as she'd braced for, but to inform her in the careful tone of a man choosing his words with unusual precision, that the parent hospitality group's board had taken an interest in the incident, and that a formal review of staff treatment policies was already underway, effective immediately, with her name attached as the catalyst. "They want to make an example of what happened," the general manager said. "In a good way, I think, though I confess I'm still deciding what that means for you specifically." Zuri left his office with more questions than answers, and outside in the loading bay where the staff took their brief breaks between shifts, she found herself staring at the gray Seoul sky, wondering how a single evening of pouring wine had unraveled into something so much larger than her. A few days later, the story took on new dimensions entirely. Baek Do-hyun, apparently unwilling to let the humiliation of that single night stand as the final word, had begun making calls, quiet ones, the kind meant to pressure rather than persuade, attempting to have Zuri quietly dismissed from her position under some fabricated pretext of customer complaint mismanagement. He assumed, wrongly, that his wealth alone would be sufficient to erase the consequences of his own cruelty, that a foreign waitress had no protection significant enough to withstand pressure from a man who owned half of Gangnam's commercial real estate. He had not accounted for the fact that Kwon Hyun-woo's organization held quiet, controlling interests in the very hospitality group that employed her. Zuri learned this not from Kwon himself, who remained conspicuously absent from the restaurant for nearly a week following the incident, but from Choi, the floor manager, who approached her nervously one evening with the air of a man delivering news he only half understood. "The board received a call," Choi said, "from someone connected to Mr. Kwon's people. They wanted to make it very clear that any attempt to terminate your employment as a result of that night would be viewed as," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "an unacceptable outcome." "What does that mean exactly?" Zuri asked. Choi shrugged helplessly. "It means, I think, that you are now considerably harder to fire than I am." That evening, working her shift on the main floor rather than the private rooms, Zuri caught sight of a familiar figure entering through the front doors, Kwon Hyun-woo, dressed as impeccably as always, though this time he did not move toward his usual corner table. Instead, he crossed the dining room directly toward the service station where she stood arranging silverware, and stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back like a man unsure, for once, of the correct etiquette for the moment. "I heard what Mr. Beek attempted," Zuri said before he could speak, keeping her voice low enough that other staff wouldn't overhear. "I also heard that it didn't work. I assume I owe you thanks for that." "You owe me nothing," Kwon said. "I simply made a phone call reminding the board that treating an employee unfairly for the crime of having dignity is bad business in every sense of the word." "That's a very diplomatic way of describing what I suspect was a considerably more direct conversation," Zuri said, and for the first time since the incident, allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Something flickered across Kwon's expression, surprise perhaps at being caught in his own understatement. "You're not wrong," he admitted. Later that night, when the restaurant had emptied and the last guests had filtered out into waiting cars, Kwon lingered near the entrance longer than his habit usually allowed, watching Zuri finish her closing duties with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. When she finally emerged from the staff entrance into the cool night air, pulling her coat tighter against the wind, she found him waiting near the curb, hands in his pockets, looking uncharacteristically like a man who had rehearsed something and then forgotten every word of it. "Can I walk you to the subway?" he asked, "or arrange a car if you'd prefer not to walk this late?" "I've walked to the subway alone every night for 8 months, Mr. Kwon," Zuri said. "I think I can manage another night." "I know," he said. "I wasn't offering because I doubted your ability to manage. I was offering because I'd like the company if you'll permit it." She studied him for a long moment, this man whose name made restaurant managers sweat, whose influence had apparently reshaped a corporation's stock price overnight, who had crossed a room full of powerful men without raising his voice and dismantled an insult with nothing but quiet, absolute authority, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed him. "All right," she said, "but I warn you, I talk about food constantly. It's an occupational hazard." "I happen to find that considerably more interesting than most conversations I have during the day," Kwon replied, and fell into step beside her as they walked. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm neither of them fully acknowledged as courtship, though it was, undeniably, exactly that. Kwon began appearing at the restaurant more frequently, though never again at his old corner table, instead finding reasons to linger near the service areas where he might exchange a few quiet words with Zuri between her duties. He never made a spectacle of his attention, never used his influence to pressure her into anything beyond the boundaries of ordinary conversation. And it was precisely this restraint, this deliberate, careful respect for the boundaries she hadn't even needed to state aloud, that slowly dismantled the wariness she'd carried since that first humiliating night. "You could have any woman in Seoul," she told him one evening as they sat in a quiet noodle shop far from the glittering excess of Cheongdam-dong, a place Kwon had chosen specifically, he admitted, because no one there would recognize either of them. "Women with connections with families who could strengthen your business, women who don't carry trays for a living. Why me?" Kwon considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, turning his chopstick slowly against the edge of his bowl. "Because most of the women I've met in my world have learned to survive by disappearing, by becoming smaller, quieter, more agreeable. The moment power enters a room," he said. "You did the opposite, you stood taller. You spoke louder in the language he assumed you didn't know. At the exact moment silence would have been easier. He looked up at her. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who bend the moment they sense danger. I didn't know what it looked like for someone not to bend until that night. Zuri felt something in her chest loosen, some guarded, protective thing she'd carried since Paris, since every kitchen that had underestimated her, since every room that had assumed her competence needed proving before it could be believed. My grandmother used to say dignity is the one thing that costs nothing and can't be repossessed, she said softly. I've spent my whole life trying to live like that was true, even when it felt like the world was determined to prove her wrong. It's true, Kwon said. I watched it happen in real time. I just wish I hadn't needed to hear a slur to recognize it. Meanwhile, across the city, Baek Do-hyun's world was unraveling in ways his money could no longer patch over. The severed hospitality contract had triggered a chain reaction through his company's quarterly earnings report, spooking already nervous investors who had been watching Baek Construction's aggressive expansion with growing unease. Financial journalists, sensing blood, began digging into rumors that had circulated quietly for years, allegations of underpaid subcontractors, of permits secured through favors rather than merit, of a corporate culture built entirely around one man's temper and the fear it generated in everyone beneath him. None of it, individually, would have been fatal. Together, arriving all at once in the wake of a single viral moment of public cruelty toward a service worker, it became a story too large for Baek Do-hyun's usual damage control to contain. A junior executive who had been present that night, one of the men who had laughed nervously at Baek's slur, leaked details of the incident to a business journalist eager for a story about the collision of old money arrogance and new era accountability. And within a fortnight, Baek Do-hyun's name had become shorthand in Seoul's business press for exactly the kind of executive culture the city's younger, more socially conscious investment class was determined to move away from. They're calling it the Ondol Grand Incident, Tae-sung told Zuri one afternoon, scrolling through his phone with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. There's an entire opinion piece about it in the Meal Business Daily, about workplace dignity, about how the culture of contempt toward service workers is bad for Korea's global reputation as it tries to attract more international talent and tourism. He looked up at her. You're mentioned. Not by name, but everyone in the industry knows it's you. Zuri read the article that night in her small apartment, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her laptop balanced on her knees, and felt a strange, complicated mixture of vindication and discomfort at seeing her private humiliation transformed into a symbol for something so much larger than herself. She had not asked to become a case study. She had simply wanted that night to finish her shift without being reduced to an object by a man who assumed his wealth made him untouchable. But institutions, it seemed, moved slowly until they moved all at once, and the Ondol Grand's parent hospitality group, sensing an opportunity to position itself at the forefront of a cultural shift rather than a target of it, announced within the month a sweeping new staff protection policy, mandatory bystander intervention training, an anonymous reporting line for mistreatment by guests, and a formal apology and compensation clause for any employee subjected to discriminatory abuse. The policy, staff quickly began calling it informally, was Zuri's Law, though no official document ever used her name. She wasn't sure at first how to feel about any of it. I didn't want to become a symbol, she told Kwon one evening as they walked along the Han River, the city lights scattering gold across the water's dark surface. I just wanted to pour wine and go home without being called something less than human. You don't get to choose what your courage becomes to other people once you've shown it, Kwon said. That part was never yours to control, but the courage itself, that was entirely yours. Nobody gave that to you, nobody can take it away either. She was quiet for a long moment, watching a barge move slowly downriver, its lights reflected in fractured lines across the water. My father used to say something similar, she said finally, that the world will always try to make you smaller than you are. The only thing you control is whether you let it. He sounds like a wise man. He worked construction for 30 years and read accounting textbooks by lamplight so that one day he could open his own small firm, Zuri said. He never did in the end. He got sick before he could, but he taught all 4 of his children that dignity wasn't something you waited for permission to claim. She looked over at Kwon. I think that's why that night didn't break me the way Baek probably expected it to. I'd already been trained my whole life for exactly that moment. Kwon reached for her hand then, carefully, the way a man reaches for something he's afraid might not want to be held. And when she didn't pull away, something in his chest, something that had been clenched tight since childhood, since watching his own father navigate a world of constant betrayal and calculated cruelty, finally, quietly released. 6 weeks after that first humiliating night in the private dining room, Baek Do-hyun requested through his lawyers, carefully worded to avoid any admission of liability, a private meeting with Zuri Adeyemi, the hospitality group's board, eager to close the chapter on an incident that had already cost them considerable reputational capital, arranged for the meeting to take place in a neutral conference room downtown, with representatives from both companies present as witnesses. Zuri arrived wearing a simple charcoal blazer, her expression composed in the same unshakable calm she had carried since that first night, though her heart hammered harder than she let show. Baek Do-hyun looked different than she remembered, thinner perhaps, his usual polished arrogance replaced by something more careful, more calculated. The look of a man who had finally learned at considerable cost that consequences existed even for people who had spent their entire lives believing themselves exempt from them. "Ms. Adeyemi," he said, rising slightly as she entered, an old formality that felt almost absurd given the circumstances. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." "I agreed because your lawyers made it clear my refusal would be interpreted unfavorably by the board reviewing your company's contract renewal," Zuri said evenly. "Let's not pretend either of us is here purely out of goodwill." Something flickered across Beek's face, not quite shame but its distant cousin. "That's fair," he admitted. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with visible difficulty, a man clearly unaccustomed to the exercise of genuine apology. "What I said that night was inexcusable. I want you to know that I understand that now in ways I clearly didn't understand it then." "Do you?" Zuri asked, her voice not unkind but not yielding either. "Or do you understand that it cost you money and that the two things only look the same from where you're sitting?" The room went quiet. One of the lawyers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Beek exhaled slowly. "Both honestly," he said. "I won't insult you by pretending the financial consequences weren't part of what made me finally sit with what I did. But I've had 6 weeks to think about very little else, Ms. Adeyemi, and I can tell you that somewhere in those 6 weeks, it stopped being about the money." He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd entered the room. "I grew up being told that people like you existed to serve people like me. Nobody ever corrected that belief because nobody around me had the courage or the standing to try. You did both in about 30 seconds in a language I assumed you couldn't speak." Zuri studied him for a long moment, weighing sincerity against performance, aware that she would likely never fully know which this was. "I don't need your understanding to have already had my dignity, Mr. Beek," she said finally. "I had that before you ever opened your mouth that night. What I'd ask for now, if you're genuinely interested in more than damage control, isn't an apology to me specifically. It's a public commitment, real, documented, enforceable, to how your company treats every worker who serves you long after this meeting is forgotten." Beek's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly having prepared for an apology and a settlement, not a demand for structural accountability. But Beek himself, after a long pause, nodded slowly. "I can do that," he said. "I think, honestly, I need to do that." The agreement that emerged from that meeting, a public commitment from Beek Construction to fund a citywide hospitality workers' dignity and anti-discrimination training program, developed in consultation with labor advocates, and implemented across every venue the company held commercial interests in, became in the following months a quietly significant shift in an industry that had long treated such abuses as an unfortunate but unavoidable cost of doing business with the wealthy. Zuri was asked to consult on the program's development, her culinary and hospitality background suddenly transformed from a source of professional frustration into precisely the credential the initiative needed. "They're offering you a full-time position," the general manager told her one afternoon, sliding a folder across his desk with an expression of genuine, if slightly bewildered, respect. "Director of Staff Training and Guest Relations Standards for the entire hospitality group, 6 locations. A salary that I suspect exceeds what you're currently making by a considerable margin." Zuri stared at the folder for a long moment, thinking of her mother stretching one chicken across a week of dinners, of her father reading by lamplight of every kitchen in Paris that had assumed she needed to prove her competence twice as hard for half the recognition. "I accept," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "On one condition. The training program includes a scholarship fund for staff members who want to pursue further culinary or hospitality education the way I once wished someone had offered me." The general manager smiled. "I think that condition will be very easy to approve." That evening Zuri found Kwon waiting for her outside the restaurant, as he had most evenings for the past 2 months, though tonight he held a small bouquet of white orchids, slightly awkward in his large hands as though he wasn't entirely certain flowers were an appropriate gesture for a man in his line of work. I heard about the promotion, he said. Taesung apparently cannot keep a secret to save his life. It hasn't even been announced yet, Zuri laughed, accepting the orchids with genuine delight. Some secrets are worth breaking the rules for, Kwon said, and then, more seriously, added, I'm proud of you, not because of what happened with Beek, though I understand why that mattered. Because of everything you were long before that night, the parts of you nobody in that dining room bothered to see. Zuri looked at him for a long moment. This quiet, dangerous, unexpectedly gentle man who had crossed a room full of powerful men to defend her dignity without ever once making the moment about himself, who had waited outside her restaurant on countless ordinary nights simply for the privilege of walking her to the subway, who had never once, in 2 months of careful courtship, asked her to be anything other than exactly who she already was. Walk me home, she asked. Always, he said, and meant it. Months later, on a bright autumn afternoon when the ginkgo trees along the Han River had turned the color of old gold, the Ondelgrand's parent hospitality group held a small ceremony to formally launch what had come to be known, informally but persistently, throughout the industry as the Adeyemi Standard, a comprehensive framework for staff dignity that other restaurant groups across Seoul had begun quietly adopting, some out of genuine conviction. Others simply because failing to do so had become, in the wake of the Baek Do-hyun scandal, a reputational risk no company wanted to carry. Zuri stood at the podium in a simple green dress, her hands steady on the sheet of notes she barely needed, and looked out at a room that included restaurant executives, labor advocates, journalists, and in the back row, quiet and unassuming as always, Kwon Hyun-woo watching her with an expression of open, undisguised pride that he had long since stopped trying to hide from anyone. I used to believe, she began, that dignity was something you had to earn permission for, that you had to prove yourself worthy of respect before you were allowed to expect it. It took a room full of powerful men underestimating me, and one man in the back of a different room refusing to let that underestimation go unanswered, to teach me that dignity was never something I needed permission to claim. It was mine from the beginning. The only question was ever whether I would insist on it. She paused, looking out at the room, thinking of her mother, her father, the kitchens in Paris that had doubted her, the years of quiet, unseen sacrifice that had brought her to this exact moment. This program isn't about punishing anyone for the past, she continued. It's about building something better than the world I walked into 8 months ago as a waitress nobody thought was worth knowing. I hope it becomes a world where the next person who stands where I stood that night doesn't have to be as brave as I had to be, because the room around her has already decided her dignity was never in question. The applause that followed was warm, sustained, genuine. And later, after the ceremony had dissolved into quiet conversation and champagne, Kwon found her near the window, watching the ginkgo leaves drift down onto the river path below. You did that, he said quietly, coming to stand beside her. All of it, I just made a phone call. You made a phone call because you were paying attention when it mattered, Zuri said. Most people in that room that night weren't. That matters more than you're giving yourself credit for. He was quiet for a moment, watching the same golden leaves she watched. My father used to tell me that true power isn't the ability to make people afraid of you, he said finally. It's the restraint to use what you have only for the things worth protecting. I spent most of my life believing that was a nice sentiment for men who could afford idealism. I don't think I understood what it actually meant until that night at the Ondel Grand. Zuri turned to look at him, this man who had built an entire life around quiet, careful control, who had crossed a crowded room without raising his voice and dismantled a billionaire's arrogance with nothing but truth and restraint, who had never once in all the months since asked her to be smaller or quieter or more convenient than she already was. And what do you understand now? She asked. That I'd rather spend my restraint protecting someone who never needed protecting in the first place, Kwon said, than waste my power on anyone who does. Outside, the last of the afternoon light caught the gold leaves scattering across the river path, and somewhere in the quiet space between two people who had found each other through a single ugly moment of cruelty and its long, slow unraveling into something better, dignity had found at last exactly the kind of ending it deserved, not loud, not vengeful, but steady, earned, and entirely real. Zuri Adeyemi had walked into that dining room 8 months earlier as a woman nobody thought worth knowing. She walked out of that ceremony as proof that the world could still, sometimes, be made to answer for its cruelty. Not with violence, not with spectacle, but with the quiet, unshakable insistence that some things were never anyone else's to take.